So recently, I've gotten really into this game called Broken Edge, and if you haven't heard of it already, it is a masterpiece of a VR sword fighting game. I would highly recommend you try it. But if you load up the game for the first time, you can't be blamed for not knowing which class to try first. That's why I'm here, to show you each class with a brief introduction and description of how they are used by beginners, as well as in higher levels of play.
But Nano, didn't you just say that you only got the game recently?
Well, yeah, but like, shush. And also, I've gotten help from some of the best players in the world to make this video for all of you. So without further ado, let's begin. First up is Barbarian, or Barb for short. Barbarian is 6 foot 6 inches and has the second longest sword in the game, only beaten by Tyrant. They have a decent max awaken at 181 for the main blade and 184 for legendary, and they are tied for the most sword health in the game along with Knight at 300 health, meaning their sword can take one hell of a beating. Barb is a medium difficulty class, as most of what it takes to play Barb is directly related to a player's skill. It thrives off your experience as a player and your overall game sense. That is why you almost never see any new Barbarians, despite almost all the top players having a strong Barb. New players should really know that they will struggle with the basic mistakes almost all players make, as Barbarian has some of the tightest speed restrictions in the game, which often messes with new players who unconsciously speed up their sword right before a clash, which is a very common mistake. New players are also going to struggle with health traits on Barb when clashing swords with their opponents, leading most new Barbarians to always try going for the body tap no matter what, while relying on the massive health pool to give them as many attempts as possible, which despite being oppressive in low elo matches is not always the best strategy. What some find to be the best strategy when playing Barbarian is to put as much pressure on their opponent as possible, trying to get the tip of their sword engaged as soon as possible, and if they feel like the traits aren't favoring them, they are happy to bounce in and out of their effective range. When playing Barbarian, you have to dictate the pace of the fight, and you have all the tools you need to do so at your disposal. You can attack your opponent's weak points extremely aggressively, and you can switch between trading health and going for a body tap so fluently that it can force your opponents to make mistakes even at the highest levels of play. Next up is Tyrant. Tyrant is 6 foot 3 inches and has the longest sword in the game. They have the highest max awaken in the game, sitting at 195 for their main blade and 200 for legendary, making traits much more favorable. Despite their appearance, Tyrant only has 180 health, making them the class with the lowest amount of health in the game. These things combined make Tyrant favor a very defensive playstyle, where you can heavily punish your opponent's mistakes, although this can go both ways. Tyrant can also grip the blade itself with their offhand, which is known as half swording. Half swording is good for getting better angles, as well as letting you move your sword faster, all at the cost of some range. Newer players will have a much easier time going for body taps thanks to the longer blade. However, the strategy does not hold up in higher elo matches due to the small health pool. More experienced players tend to play extremely defensively, forcing their opponent into situations where they're likely to make a mistake, and only going for something once a mistake has been made. Although you should try to mix it up in order to stay unpredictable, but that can be said for every class. Next up is Duelist. Duelist is 5 foot 6 inches, and is the first class in this video with a secondary. Duelist has 210 health and a max awaken of 175 for main blade and 183 for legendary. Duelist's secondary weapon is the parrying dagger, which sits at a constant 20 awaken, and just like all secondaries, it only has one use no matter what you hit. Now, new players often don't worry about the specifics of how they should max their awaken, and only focus on not dropping awaken, which is quite easy on Duelist, as Duelist can consistently keep a good amount of awaken even when playing relatively aggressively. However, when getting into a more competitive format, Duelists will often pick up the legendary blade for a higher max awaken, as it's often worth it despite the shorter reach. It's a common progression for Duelists to begin slowing down their playstyle as running becomes less useful against higher skill players, forcing Duelists to begin focusing more on trading. Next up is Knight. Knight is 6 feet tall and has a max awaken of 181 for both their main and legendary blades. As mentioned earlier in the video, Knight is tied with Barbarian for the most health in the game, sitting at 300 health. Much like Duelist, Knight has a secondary sitting at a constant 20 awaken, that being their short sword. Unlike Duelist, however, Knight also has a shield which can take 1 to 3 hits depending on how you use it. Knight is a bit basic in theory, and it's very much a jack of all trades style class, but along with Duelist, they are my personal pick for new players. Next up is Pirate. Pirate is 6 feet tall and has a max awaken of 160 for main blade and 169 for legendary. Pirate sits at 210 health and has 4 secondaries, making them the class with the most weapons by far. Pirate secondaries are a Kriegsmesser and rapier on the back, a boarding axe on the hip, and a knife in their mouth. The Kriegsmesser, rapier, and boarding axe all sit at a constant 30 awaken. However, like all axes in the game, the boarding axe does no damage if hit on the handle.
Then there's the knife, which has an extremely short reach, but practically works like a second edgebreaker, sitting at 165 awaken if you're using main blade, or 170 if you're using legendary. New pirates will tend to rely heavily on their secondaries, using them very liberally without realizing how strong pirate's primary weapon can be. Meanwhile, more experienced pirates will tend to use their primary weapon through most of the round, and then begin using their secondaries towards the end game for more pressure. Next up is Ronin. Ronin is 5 foot 9 inches and has a max awaken of 184 for their main blade and 197 for legendary. Ronin sits at 245 health and has a couple unique features. First off, Ronin is the first and only class on the list with a scabbard, which they must sheath their sword in and only pull out of at the last second. Secondly, Ronin has a unique awaken criteria, freeze pose. Whenever you hit something with your sword or scabbard, stop moving for a second. You'll see your hands begin flaming. The more still you stood, the bigger the flames. And the bigger the flames, the more bonus awaken you'll get on your next hit. Ronin also gets a second edgebreaker, called their sheath breaker, which can be used once per round by blocking an attack with your sword while it's halfway in your sheath. Due to these things, Ronin is a class all about precision, and very much lends itself to a counter-attack focused playstyle. Focus on identifying openings in your opponent's awakening style, and then thread the needle through that opening.
Next up is Viking. Viking is 6 feet tall and has 260 health. They also have a max awaken of 155 for their main blade and 167 for legendary, making them the class with the lowest max awaken in the game. Viking also has 2 axes as secondaries that function like an extra edgebreaker when dual wielded. And much like Knight, Viking has a 3-stage shield. Now, although you're probably sick of hearing me say this, I don't play this class, so this part of the video will be done by Orphan Obliterator.
Hello everybody. If you don't know me, I'm Orphan Obliterator, a Viking main, and I'm here to tell you about Viking at high and low levels. Viking is a good starter pick at low elo due to the fact that he has really easy awakening. Viking shield can also be really good at blocking body taps, which are the best way to win at really low elo. Viking's axes are also multi-tools, which can both block many hits, as well as getting an extra edgebreaker from the axes as mentioned earlier. You'll probably see the best Vikings playing defensively, opting for a more passive and reactive playstyle than an aggressive one. With this more defensive playstyle, you can pull out the axes at any time for a quick edgebreaker or to get some sneaky body taps in. Even though I personally consider playing defensive Viking's best playstyle, it's definitely not the only way to play him. You can also play Viking extremely aggressive and play for baits, thanks to his high speed cap and dual axes.
Next up is Persian. Persian is 6 foot 3 inches and has a max awaken of 183 for their main blade and 180 for legendary. Persian is also the only class to have 2 primary weapons, although they have no secondaries. This means both of their swords can regrow, but both are also subject to taking awakening damage, as well as damaging their gauge. Persian is a class of misdirection, at least at lower levels of play, constantly making your opponent second guess which sword will be used, and getting either a body or hilt tap in their confusion. Persian also has a technique called Cat's Claw, where higher level Persians will attack while swinging against the curve of their blade in order to wrap around the opponent's defense, this being at the cost of some awaken. And even when not going for body taps, Cat's Claw can be very effective at reaching your opponent's hilt. Persian thrives when playing defensive, catching almost any body tap much more easily than most classes, and getting good cut damage while doing so thanks to the occasional Cat's Claw technique. This all culminates in Persian slowly whittling down their opponent until a body tap is inevitable. Next up is Samurai, or Sam for short. Samurai is 6 feet tall and has a max awaken of 195 for their main blade and 192 for legendary. Samurai sits at 250 health and has 2 identical secondaries sitting at a constant 30 awaken. Samurai's main mechanic is rhythm, which is where you have to do your moves to a, well, rhythm. Failures to do so will drop your awaken. Samurai also has an incredibly high speed cap and lends itself to an extremely aggressive playstyle, constantly going for feints and body taps. However, Samurai is also widely considered one of the most difficult classes, and I wouldn't recommend them to any new players. But if you're feeling daring, there's nothing wrong with giving Samurai a go.